It's perhaps hard to think of an author who's more iconically English, or at least perceived to be iconically English, than Charlotte Brontë. The image behind me is a metallic plaque from near where the Brontë family are buried, and it records her death in 1855, 170 years ago. She died 170 years ago yesterday, but what if I was to say Charlotte Brontë, the Irishwoman? I think many people, unless they have a particular interest in literature, will think, well, the presenter's gone bonkers. But if you do have an interest in literature, even a glancing one, you've probably run across the fact that the Bronte family's roots lie in Ireland. And we'll be going on about that today, mainly because it plays into the idea of what is an identity. This is the one of the few pictures of the Bronte sisters that's known to exist where they are all in a group with that wonderful fold down the middle. And it's in the National Portrait Gallery in Ireland. And here we have Anne Bronte, Emily Bronte, and Charlotte Bronte. And if I click on them, you can see which one is which. And that's Charlotte over to the right. You can also resize it, zoom in on it, and play around with it generally to get an idea of it, what it looked like. It was done by Patrick Branwell Bronte. But there's a story behind it, which I'll read out. This painting is the only surviving group portrait of one of Britain's great literary families, the three famous novelist sisters, Anne, Emily, and Charlotte Bronte, and their teenage brother, Rob. Sisters draw their own experiences to produce original and powerful writing, which is true. But what's more interesting is the rediscovery of this painting. The painting was rediscovered in 1914 on top of a wardrobe at Hill House, Banagher in Ireland by Mrs. M.A. Nichols, the second wife of Charlotte Bronte's widower, the Reverend A.B. Nichols. That's right. Most people don't appreciate that Charlotte Bronte's husband was from Ireland, as well as the family's roots in Ireland. And just to draw a further line under that, here's an article from the Irish Times from, I think it's about 7 years ago, yep, using the same portrait, which has been tidied up somewhat, I should imagine, by the wonders of digital machinations to look a bit more clean. The folds down the middle are gone. And it comments on how the Irish ancestry of the Brontes was something that wasn't entirely considered desirable and something that they kept under wraps at times. I'll read out part of it. One of the oddest reactions to Sally Wainwright's recent brilliant TV drama about the Brontes to Walk Invisible was an objection to the Yorkshire accents, which seems a bit silly considering where the Brontes came from. Some fans had imagined the literary sisters speaking received pronunciation. Well, I imagine that's probably a perception that's grown up around them, especially as they've acquired such an iconic status that they become almost a touristy image of England. I imagine people coming here as tourists, imagine them speaking in a very refined way all the time. I wonder what they'd have said if Wainwright had focused more on the Brontes' childhood, when Charlotte, Branwell, Emily, and Anne still had Irish accents inherited from their father. They lost them when they went to school, yet they never lost a sense of being outsiders of never quite fitting in. Both of their parents were strangers to Yorkshire. Their mother came from Cornwall, another area that, in its own way, could be viewed as having its own national identity as well, and that outside of England. And there'd be many people from Cornwall who'd point that out. The aunt who looked after them did so after their mother died, but it was their father, Patrick, who really felt foreign. And it's their father, Patrick, who basically comes from an extremely poor background in a county down, where he'd grown up in a large, and as it notes, very poor family as the son of a farmhand, fence fixer, and road builder, and then took up an unlikely journey going through Cambridge University before becoming a minister. I'll read out some of that. 3 years after a local priest found him reading to himself in a country lane, which was unusual enough. Many of the rural poor in Ireland simply couldn't read or were illiterate in that era. And he was reading Paradise Lost, of all things, by John Milton, and doing the voices, which must have been quite interesting. Patrick's life started to change. He was given an education. Within a year, he was a teacher himself. Inside a book, he wrote his name over and over, varying the spelling from Brontë to Prutti to Prunty. Now, there's a number of literary theories about why he changed his name to this, ranging on it meaning all sorts of things in other languages. And I'm not particularly convinced by any of them, but there's something you might want to investigate on your own time. I think he just settled on a name that sounded convenient, in the same way that Jewish people used to anglicize their names. The Irish people journeying to America would drop the O's and the Macs to sound slightly more English. Astonishingly, he got himself to Cambridge, which, considering the background he came from that era, is incredibly astonishing, because Cambridge in that day and era was for the sons, not the daughters, just the sons. Ladies weren't yet going to uni in this era, remember? Private tuition, maybe, or private schools, but the Oxbridge set didn't want them educated up there. He became ordained, and then to Yorkshire to be the perpetual curate of the moorland village of Haworth. And as it notes, and you'll find quite a lot of academic literature on this, Patrick's job for life didn't stop him feeling like a stranger in a strange land. He was never allowed to forget he was an immigrant, and his children were constantly reminded of it too. This was, after all, an era in which the Irish were always characterized as childish, lazy, primitive, dirty, and alcoholic. Or if you want to swap it and find some more positive characteristics, you'll find them characterized as passionate and wild, but it's always combined with a certain air of condescension about it. As at any moment they might run off the leash and do something naughty. They're not quite civilized. And there we have that famous quote. I mentioned that in an earlier video. The novelist Charles Kingsley, who referred to the Irish as human chimpanzees in a particularly disgusting passage from his work, where he referred to them where they were starving and in dire need, human chimpanzees. A particular lack of empathy there. Now, it goes on to tell you about how Patrick's daughter, Charlotte, tried to downplay her Irish roots. And yet it's Patrick's daughter, Charlotte, who would marry an Irishman in the end, even if you, in this case, I would point out, it's a Protestant Irishman. And we have a collision of cultures, because her father started off from a mixed marriage, where one side was Catholic and one side was Protestant, which was enough to make him an outcast in Ireland in that era. He amazingly managed to acquire a very high education for that era, pops over to England to become a curate. Then his daughter pops back over to marry up an Anglican curate over there. So, although Charlotte Brontë is considered one of the, iconic figures, if you were thinking of English literature and someone said, I don't know, name 5 authors, she'd definitely probably be in there. You'd probably throw out Austen, Brontë, Shakespeare, a couple of others. And yet, is she Irish? Is she English? Or is she a mixture of both? And it raises the idea of what's an identity? Where do we draw the line? The local area that she moved to in Ireland maintains quite a lot of links with her, and there's numerous societies there. But you also have this, the Brontë Ireland Society, and you have some more information here on her father. Patrick Brontë, born to as I noticed, a mixed marriage, Protestant father and a Roman Catholic mother in 1777. Mixed marriages weren't that common. They weren't as uncommon as some people think now. They weren't absolutely unknown. but they were likely to cause you suspicion and issues. And this gives a great deal of background in a great deal of broader background on Bronte's life. And it gives you these theories, one of them anyway, about why he changed his name. Along this journey, Bronte became Bronte, supposedly a transliteration of the Greek for thunder. Possible. I've heard the theory before. I think more likely is the second theory there, to escape the stigma of his brothers William's entanglement with the United Irishmen, who'd been involved in a major revolt in 1798, and change it as far as possible. It notes as well that Patrick's final visit to Ireland was in 1806. And though he sent his relatives copies of Charlotte's works, he corresponded with his Irish relatives rarely. And he himself published a religious novel in 1880, which actually was notable for detailing the deficiencies of Catholicism. And this quote by Elizabeth Gaskell, which pops up in many commentaries on Bronte, will give you a good idea, perhaps, of the Victorian view of the Irish character. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote that his strong, passionate Irish nature was in general compressed down with resolute stoicism. As I say, this idea of the Irish as sort of at any moment inclined to fly off the handle, or the stereotype of the Irish temper or passion and inability to govern seems to underlie that. Now, there are a number of other literary figures who have odd and interesting relationships with Ireland, and one of those is Rudyard Kipling. And Kipling is a figure I'd like to turn to possibly next, or possibly in a few videos, because Kipling's relationship with Ireland is incredibly complicated and paradoxical. On one hand, he was a strong unionist, and his opinions on Catholicism are far from flattering. But on the other, when his son died as part of an Irish regiment, Kipling was instrumental in paying for graves for loads and loads of Catholic soldiers and helping their families out. So he's very hard to sum up. And these kind of contradictions and strange paradoxes and strange views of each other are all part of the game and joy of English literature. So it's up to you to decide, is Charlotte Brontë still just an English author?